start. So the bathrooms are on the landing up there as you come in. There's tea at the back and also a paper where you can add your name to the Canberra Heart Stories mailing list, because I know some of you got here through Nancy's mailing list. So if you want to know about what's coming up in next month, and the month after, and the month after, you can, the paper's up there. The event tonight is being filmed, so if anyone is not happy to be on that, please let Tonya know and she can advise you where you could move your seat to. Phones, please, to be, if we can, put them off. And we have, our 2 comfortable chairs for people with backs and sore backs and things are already taken. But if anyone else has a problem, I'm happy to swap my softer chair for one of these. Would anyone need another more comfortable chair? Everyone's good? Excellent. And one more thing, I know a couple of people came in at the last moment, and I also know that Eventbrite cuts off tickets about an hour before the event. So if you, there's a little dish up there if you're one of those people. So, have a lovely breath. Bring ourselves into this beautiful space. So, first I'd like to acknowledge the First Peoples of the ACT, here where we live and work and sit and stand. Formerly known as the Ngunnawal people, but also including the Ngambri, Ngerigo, Yuin and Wiradjuri people who spent a lot of time on the ACT. So may their ancestors, past, present and future, continue to teach ours. Welcome.
Is this Nancy's lecture?
Here she is. And here is the chairs. Okay. So
somebody else coming too, actually.
Yeah, so there's our acknowledgement. We'll just need to keep going and people can just come in late. There's a couple of chairs at the back there. So Canberra Heart Stories is modelled on an organisation in Melbourne called the Melbourne Weekly Service, which is a very inspiring and intriguing organisation I was invited to contribute to last year. It was founded in September 2015 by 2 Canadians who wanted to build something that would address the epidemic of loneliness, social isolation and disconnection that they perceived was at the heart of many of the social and psychological problems that exist in modern Western society. Something that would respond to our core human needs for belonging, connection, community, meaning, and contribution. And they use the word service as in service to community. So as an author and biographer, I was inspired and humbled to bring this model to Canberra as Heart Stories. Canberra Heart Stories is a curated storytelling space. So we have the heart storyteller and I suppose curator, but I prefer the word story caretaker, actually. It's a space for people to connect and explore the heart story way of being with themselves and being together. Heart stories are personal stories told from people's own experience that usually shed light on bigger things and offer connection with the storyteller on an emotional level. Heart stories invite the listener to draw meaning from the story into their own lives. Thus, the Heart Story Way can enrich, offer purpose, wisdom, hope, and perhaps lead us in new directions. A Story with Heart aims to not be a discussion of concepts, projects and strategies, or a sharing of professional expertise or advice, though these things come through as part of telling a personal story. Rather, the storyteller and story caretaker birth and prepare the story together through spending time in uninterrupted telling, listening, identifying themes, metaphors, and the gem which all stories carry. It can be quite overwhelming to tell your story, which is why Heart Story supports the storyteller with this model of storyteller, story caretaker. So, everybody has a heart story, and everybody is welcome to be in the storyteller chat. So, let's go to from a love for nets to net art and networking. So, Nancy comes from a background of art practice, as I'm sure we know. She holds an honours degree and a Master of Arts in Fine Art from the UK, and has had multiple exhibitions in both the UK and Australia. She's also been awarded a Churchill Fellowship for her project Painting with Parkinson's, which she founded in 1994 in response to her husband's diagnosis with Parkinson's. Nancy went on to establish Networks Australia for Artists in 2008. Her work has been further recognised by the World Parkinson Coalition, the Robin Elliott Award for Service to Community in 2019, and the ACT Chief Minister's Inclusion Award in 2014. For Nancy, nets are dualistic art. She explains, while we net the fibres together into often breathtaking designs, breathtaking spaces are also created. However, these spaces can cause loss of things and remind us of our own losses and aloneness. As well, she says, while making nets gathers and networks people, they can also bring entrapment to both people and nature. As well, it's been vital for Nancy to network between Australia and the UK for her family, friends, and Quaker spiritual support in both countries. So, Nancy tells me that her love for nets began in 2004. Would you like to tell us what happened then?
I was in India and watching them bring the catch in Kerala. And the way they draped the nets was just so beautiful. And the way they laid it out on the sand to dry for the poor fellow to have to come and repair the nets. He would be sitting on this vast area of nets laid out, making the most beautiful patterns. You can see some of those images in the books over there later. And I thought, for me at that time, I was trapped in my life. I had a husband who'd had Parkinson's for, I don't know, 25 years or something by then, and that was something that I had to deal with and wanted to be helping him at the same time keep my own life afloat. And the net metaphor, of course, is about being very beautiful with the drapes, but also being about catching and trapping, and well, it's for catching fish, basically, we think of nets, but in other ways, trapping things. We'll see other images over there. By then I was almost at the end of my MA project, so I wasn't able to explore the possibilities as part of that so much, but later, when I'd established my studio in Canberra from about 2007, I got down to making nets myself and getting the feel of what that was like. So some of those examples, there's one draped over the piano there. I was using a ball of material that a friend had given to me, which was hemp thread, and it's had the most beautiful bounce to it. So I got introduced to a whole range of new materials, and you can see the difference in the texture of the one over the piano and the one over the table. The one over the table is made of nettle thread, and that again is, I call it a bed of nettles, but it's soft, it's beautiful. It had two sides to it. It's something that we associate with something really unpleasant, but in fact, it made this, beautiful length. In fact, it's called a bed of nettles because it's the size of a bed. And whilst I was doing that, whilst I was learning how to make these, I thought, well, this is about networking, and you could network with people. And I had a number of friends who were working in net-like materials, weavers, people who were crocheting. We had some workshops too. One was about making billows, which is net-like image, and another one on wire netting as well. And so very much at that time, I was thinking in terms of the artists who were interested, being involved in using net-like materials. But now it's moved on. We've had over 30 members. Not all the people who were original group are still there, but we've got an exhibition at the moment, Belconnen Arts Centre. I think it's 21 people. We get young people coming in, which excites me, because this means that the group will keep going. The older ones move away or become ill or something like that, and I'll probably phase out soon. But when I started it, I thought, I'm not going to have any rules about this, we'll just see where it takes us. We actually collaborated with a group in England that I'd done my MA with, and they said, oh, what a good idea, we'll have an exhibition at the same time as you did. So we had a virtual exhibition with them in Lancaster University at the same time as we did at the ANU here, and then we collaborated a couple of years later with an exhibition at Geelong, which was part of Textile Fibre Forum. And the thing just grew like topsy. I didn't have to do much. People just were interested in the idea of something being not very formal. So that, for instance, I met a really good photographer recently, and I said, well, have you thought about photographing artists at work? And she said, oh, that's a good idea. I said, well, we could have an exhibition which is about the photographs of them working, and then a piece of their work at the end of it. And we're working on that at the moment. And that's been a huge success. And then there was somebody else who was a performance artist. It's not limited to textile artists by any means, and that's how I hoped it. It also took us overseas, which we hadn't expected. Well, partly because of the link with England, but also they had a connection with Turku. And in 2011, 4 of us went from Australia to Turku and took part in a conference at the School of Design there, where they were doing a project with their students on nets. And Valerie Kirk did a project on nets too at the School of Art here. And she took an exhibition to Mexico, to a big textile conference there, and Sharon Peoples took a collection of nets to Bratislava, and that then travelled to Amsterdam. We've now sort of folded back to Canberra because for practical reasons, and partly with COVID too. And our exhibitions tend to be planned here and then go to, at the moment, an area not far from Canberra. We've had a big one in Wagga, and then we're planning one to have it up in the McLean Galleries, up in northern New South Wales. Anyway,
so
sitting back wondering what was going to happen without me doing
well, lots happened. So from 2004 in Kerala to starting Networks Australia, so that's a lot of things happening in that short space of time. Yeah. So
it was a very busy time.
Yeah. Yeah. So almost immediately, when we first had our storytelling preparation, birthing at your house, one of the first things that you said was about the duality of nets, the fibres connecting and the spaces between, and how that really like mirrors life, if you like. So I'm wondering if you then went on to like consciously create that metaphor in your work, like when you're creating things, consciously thinking of the connecting and the spaces in your creative process.
I find spaces fascinating, and I can't understand why more people don't get excited about nets, or they don't get excited about nets, but I think because of the way they move and they create these spaces that open and close. I remember as a student being fascinated by the fact that Henry Moore thought spaces were as important as the solids, and I think that's part of it, and also that nets have a great fluidity, so that the spaces keep changing, and you can fall through the spaces, can't you? You can fall through the holes. So it was a metaphor for me trying to come to terms with having a husband who was very seriously ill, and who was seriously ill for, in a sense, 30 years, and what he was going through, and then what we were all going through as a family, trying to come to terms with this without a lot of support, and also realising that we didn't have a lot of support here because we were both English and our families were in England, apart from the immediate family that we had here. So in a way, I think, looking back, that the whole business of that networking organisation was me trying to form a network to replace what I had had in another country, in another situation. I had to make my own here. And so it became a different sort of family.
So there was about networking for family, all your family members here and there, and then there was also something in you that wanted to really network about art and artists as well.
I don't think I was very aware of it at the time. I mean, it obviously came out of me having this idea of sort of making nets, but because of the way painting with Parkinson's grew, I think had how to describe it, ability to get people to connect in some way, which I never thought about it, but looking back, painting with Parkinson's has been going 28 years now, and we've got links all over the world. Out of me just thinking I would do something nice for people who were having a horrible time.
Yes.
I didn't have any philosophical idea behind it when I started. But because I really believed in what I was doing, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, often very wonderful and great things vary from our own need. Have you found that?
Yes, because I was not brought up in a household where we did lots of voluntary work, or even, the main thing was to make sure your family functioned and that you behaved properly, etc. In fact, I came from 5 generations of lawyers, so there were no artists in the family either. So I was considered very peculiar, so my brother tells me. But other artists would understand. I didn't think I was peculiar. That was their perception. But I think, yes. Well, just coming back to what you were saying.
I was just commenting that often these things are not conscious,
That's
and
right.
they come from a need that we have in ourselves to do something, to support ourselves, and then it suddenly grows like this.
Well, I find that very interesting. You said that, because my husband once said to me, he said, well, you're a leader. And I thought, well, I've spent my whole life trying not to be a leader, because that means responsibility. I was the eldest of 3 children. I didn't want to be responsible. and I must say to my parents' credit, they never made me be the one that has to look after my brother and sister, or anything like that. But I think perhaps because of me not taking up that role, it was a long time before I realised that I was actually quite good at it.
Mm. And bringing people together, obviously. Yes.
Yes, and I think the whole move to Australia helped with that.
Yeah.
I don't think I was aware of that either until it was a very real need. I was very lucky when I came to Australia that, well, I was saying lucky, I insisted that we moved into a small community rather than the suburbs because I felt that that was an easier way of connecting with people.
Yeah.
And also through the Quaker community,
Yes.
suddenly I was in touch with people who understood about how the English think. Even though they're migrants, they're still not thinking the way Australians do quite often.
Mm.
And those two things together
Yeah.
made a big difference as to how quickly it
Yeah.
settled.
So you've shared that the networking about the art and the networking for your family, but also that it was very much about making the fibres meet, if you like, your Quaker spiritual support in England and in Australia. So can you tell us a little bit about why the Quakers for you?
Well, one of my closest friends at university was a Quaker, and as a result, I was introduced to through Quaker meeting. I had nothing to do with it. My parents were definitely against things like Quakerism. Any form of religion was not discussed, although I was brought up as an Anglican. And it really spoke to me. Everything about her lifestyle and about the way her parents lived, the simplicity of it, the use of silence. That wasn't a surprise because my father used silence a lot. We weren't a family who felt they ought to be talking all the time. But I mean, if it's not too much of a diversion, I must explain my first introduction to Quaker meeting. My husband, 6 weeks after he arrived here, and I was just married and knew nothing about anything to do with Australia, and my husband had been working out as a geologist for 4 years already here, so he knew people, but he went off to Antarctica for 3 months, and I was here on my own, and after about 6 weeks, I was finding the tough really hard, finding it going really tough, you know, and so we tried going to St John's because we had both had Anglican backgrounds before Bob went away, and I didn't feel any attachment at all there. But whilst he was away, after about 6 weeks, I went along to a Quaker meeting, and the person on the door knew my friends in England, which was a good start. Somebody stood up in the middle of the meeting, and I can't remember what she said, but she spoke with a broad Lancashire accent. Well, I've got a Lancashire accent, but hers was very, you know, of a particular place, and I thought, whereabouts in Lancashire she's from? It's obviously not Liverpool, it's not Burnley where they roll their R's, you know, where is it? She was brought up a mile from where I was brought up, and her brother was at school with my father, and together with a third person, they had bought a car together in London for £15 and called it Marina when they were studying, because Princess Marina was all the rage. And the third person that stood up, Paul Martin, said he brought greetings from Sidcutt School. Now my friend in England had been to Sidcutt School and her husband, and they were all in the same year. And I just felt as if I'd come home.
Yeah. And I guess one of the touchstones, if you like, the draw card for you with the Quakers sounds like it was the simplicity of their lifestyle and thinking, which is actually interesting how that, going back to your art now, how that simplicity is reflected in making nets, but it's actually also very complex. So I'm wondering if I'd love you to choose one of the pieces that you brought and tell us about how you made that and what's involved. I'd love to make the netball was really intriguing for me when you were telling me about that.
So shall we look at this? It's the same technique for those tennis balls as well. This is made, people usually say to me, oh, well, you just got a ball and covered it in nets. I said, no, that's made entirely of nets. There is no padding, nothing. And that was important to me, and it was also important to me that I didn't use any stitching or glue. The material itself had to be the thing that attached to itself. And also doing this is a very meditative process. It's like the making of nets, and that appealed to me. I like things that, you know, slow. And it's actually probably heavier than a netball. It's extremely heavy. Actually, Tanja, you haven't got that. Is there samples? Have you put them somewhere? Oh, it doesn't matter. But these are made of the nets that you get fruit from at the market. So it was totally recycling. And you usually can get, they're usually red nets, or possibly yellow nets, but very occasionally you get them in blue nets, or purple nets, and those were saved, those were special, so they were kept until you put the very last layer on. And the technique was to cut them into strips, cut the bags into strips, long strips, and keep winding. But the trick was that you had to make sure that it kept its ball shape all the time. It wasn't going off at angles, you had to keep it completely round. Also, it had to be exactly the same size as a proper netball. I played netball at school, but I got the measurements, I thought, no, it's got to be exactly, you know, but within that, of course, it's made from a completely mad material that you could never associate with making a ball. And that appealed to me. It's called a net ball. The 10 knitted balls that are on the table there were recently exhibited at the Camden Museum and Art Gallery, and they couldn't get the fact that I wanted it to be labelled 10, T-E-N, brackets, N-I-S, tennis, net, balls. So they wrote 10 net balls, and that, you know, to me, that they missed the whole point of it. So, I mean, there's a duality there too, because
yes.
of me playing around with words and as well as just playing around with the materials. But I became through this whole process, I realised I had a great fascination for materials.
Yes.
Trying, you know.
Since at least 2004, you tell us.
Well, I haven't got a piece of it here actually, but in Finland, we went to a recycling place which was electrical parts and computer parts, and there was a piece of cable casing or cable sheathing. It's the stuff they put wires in when they're all going all over the place, and an electrician wants to keep them neat and tidy, and they put them in this, which is like a three-dimensional casing, a long tube. And I thought, well, that's really interesting, so I brought that back. But it was only a short piece. And I tried to get some more of it in Australia, but here they make it in a sort of way that it can't be unravelled. They make it better, really, if you like. I don't know where the original paste came from. It may not have been Finland. But a friend then found me some on the internet that I got from Canada. And that frayed beautifully. And you could pull the ends out and I made spiders and trees and all sorts of things with it. And it was that business of transforming something very ordinary and coming out with something which really was quite extraordinary.
And also the duality of that, not only something very ordinary as a cord for an electric appliance, but
that's right. What was
we
the
might have a negative thing about this appliance doing something on the planet, and here you've made it into something beautiful.
But at the same time, it was about communication technology.
Right.
And I was, you know, so that when we came to do a project about trees, the Networks group had an exhibition called Tree Conversations, which was at the Wagga Art Gallery. And it was about the way trees talk to one another. There's been a lot written about that, starting, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, with that book by, is it Wallenberg? There's a German book, there's an American book, and possibly an English book about it. But it's about how they connect underground, but they also connect above. And so some of my images were about connecting above and below, and using a material which was to do with connections,
So
electrical
yes,
connections.
lots and lots of meanings.
Yeah, I like that.
So, where you've mentioned a couple of times about and we all know that language, whole words in language can mean many different things, have many dualities, and as in communication, our verbal communication, our non-verbal communication, we can be doing or saying something and it can be meaning something completely different. And so that brings us to this lovely book that you did actually with a poet, using your watercolours and a poetry with her, and you've kept it along the theme of duality by calling it juxtapositions in a way. So please tell us more about how this came about.
Well, as a family, we went to Cambridge in 1977 to 8 because my husband wanted to study at the Scott Polar Research Institute to do it. He did an MA. And whilst he was there, I had my third son. And I met a woman who was also having her third child at childbirth classes. And we became very great friends. And she was a poet, and a Jewish poet. And eventually she wrote a poem called The Golden Calf, which won the Seatonian Prize, which is the prize for the best prize on a religious subject at Cambridge University. And she asked me if I would illustrate it. And I said, well, I don't really do that. You know, I didn't think of myself as somebody who would be able to perhaps do a series of illustrations about a particular subject. What I could do was to do an emotional response to what I was reading in her poems. And what she did with The Golden Calf was to take the stories from the Old Testament, but rewrite them as you would from the voice of a woman living today. And that is not how it's described in the Bible. So there was a lot more emotion in what she was saying, and it was also taking into account how women would feel about all those stories. And actually, then so I did that. In fact, that booklet is already with the printer, the one about the Golden Calf. This one, she came out as an artist in residence from Cambridge to Strathnairn, where I have my studio, as the first poet in residence there. And we put on this exhibition called Juxtapositions, which is what that is about, which is another series of poems, mainly about Esther, and various religious topics, but very much from the women's point of view. And I've done a series of watercolours in relation to those as well. So that's how that was a collaboration, and that was a new venture for me, which opened up all sorts of doors.
It's very beautiful. I love the way that she's done the poetry and interpreted the story from a woman's point of view. It's very, very special.
It's clever and special.
Very special.
Yeah.
So, next, and being a museum curator, lots of interesting push and pull in there between, from being an artist yourself to curating and bringing in other artists' work and making that exhibitable. So tell us a bit about you in that world as a museum curator.
Well, as I seem to have started off in lots of cases, I went into it being a bit negative, really. I didn't want to be a teacher. I'd been in the education establishment for 23 years or something, and my parents also felt it was time to get out and do something else. But I also loved the idea of, I was interested in collections and archives. Anyway, I was very lucky with my first job. It was in a provincial gallery where they were building up a modern collection, and I understood about that because I'd just come from art school. What I realised looking back on, and which I wasn't aware of at the time, was I was very interested in the idea of communicating with the public in a way that they could understand. I get very cross when people talk about painting en plein air. I thought, well, you're talking to people who don't have a French background, why can't we talk about it painting outside? Please. But things like that. Well, in fact, I once, through a museum route, and having to speak at a conference, I was encouraged to join the Art Association of Australia. And after a couple of years, I resigned. And because it didn't seem relevant to what I was doing. And they said, well, why are you resigning? I said, because I can't understand what you're writing about. Because academic speak was not the same as talking to people who were going around a gallery who hadn't seen that work before. It was a totally different way of looking at things. And I realised that was my strength. My strength was not particularly academic. But I did like the idea of getting through to people who thought the thing was complete nonsense. And I worked hard at that. So I worked in museums on and off for 12 years, but I left 3 times because when you're working in a museum, you're working in a left-brain environment. You're interpreting other people's work. And when you get home, you think, right, when I finish work and at weekends, I will get on with my own work. But you can't, because your brain is not set up for a right brain way of thinking. And so the only way to get round that was to leave the museum and go and work in an art school, perhaps part-time, for a while, and then eventually go short of money and be offered a job back in an art school, in an art gallery, so you go back in again. And the 3rd time I did that was when Bob was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And suddenly, in the drama of that, and there were, that involved things like going into deep depression, perhaps not having enough money because we had 3 children. The eldest had just started high school, but he might not be able to keep working for much longer, so I needed to get a full-time job. And the only one I was qualified for was as a curator. I also needed the sort of job where people would tell me what to do, because I was not capable, in that stage, of working on my own in a studio, but thinking for myself. I remember the first job I was given when I went to the War Memorial in the art section was to photocopy. Now, I'd never photocopied before, and I photocopied solidly for 2 weeks. And I learned all sorts of things which were not, perhaps not very important long-term, except things like, the public service thing about writing reports and having to do articles for magazines and things like that. That became very useful when I started painting with Parkinson's. I'd learned how to work around the system a bit, when I had to apply for money, or even to find a place to run the course, even to get materials and things like that. So it was a step. But after 4 or 5 years, I realised I was capable then of working on my own, and I left and went back to teaching part-time, partly at home and in evening classes. And then at the end of about a year, I had this idea, which is one of those lightning moments. You're walking along sometime, you think, they want me to be secretary of Parkinson's ACT, that is my worst nightmare. Bob was the president this year. But I'm going to have to help him anyway, whether I'm president or not. So I'd better think of something else quickly. So I went to Parkinson's ACT and I said, I'd like to run an art group for people with Parkinson's. And they said they had some money there that they hadn't been able to use because they were told to use it for a new project. And nobody had come up with an idea. And at the same time, the Southern Adult Education Organisation, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was based in Nara, and that funded my classes that I ran from home. They had a special needs grant coming up, and I was eligible for that.
So you found a beautiful home for a long time now for painting with Parkinson's at Botanical
We're
Gardens.
so lucky, but that was about networking as
yes,
well, and museums.
How did that connection happen?
Well, after working at the War Memorial for 4.5 years, I went across and I was promoted to a job at the National Museum. And I'd only been in there 2 days and I realised it was a big mistake because it was nothing to do with art. I mean, there were art things, and of course there was the big collection of Aboriginal art, and that was great. but apart from that, it wasn't my field. So I spent the rest of the next 9 months working out how I was going to get out. But I was in the PR department, and at that time, the Botanic Gardens had a marvellous new programme in which they employed Anne Joyce as their PR person, and she was outstanding, and I got to know her well. And when I was working on how to get the Painting with Parkinson's programme, she's saying, we've got this new building, which is actually, it was actually designed by someone who'd had a Churchill Fellowship in Canada to look at facilities for people in Botanic Gardens for people with disabilities. And she said it's got all the facilities, and so it was perfect because it had the parking, it had the disability access, it was quiet, it was in a very pleasant place.
And all the beautiful things around to paint.
Absolutely. And so we're still there 28 years later.
Yeah. So, Nancy, in amongst all of this, you fitted in a Churchill Fellowship.
Well, that was because of the Painting with Parkinson's. When I started the group, one of the conditions of the grant from the Southern Adult Education Authority was to have 12 people in it. I thought, well, how am I going to get 12 people? Which is a new group. Anyway, so I took no notice of that and I started with 2. And then Bob joined, that was 3. And then somebody came in as on the advice of her doctor because he thought it might help her deal with depression. And I suddenly realised I have no training in art therapy. That was the one area that I hadn't studied. And so I was talking to a friend about this, and she said, well, why don't you apply for a Churchill Fellowship to get the training you need? So I did, and I got it. and I've got the book there, actually. It was the most amazing adventure of my life, I think. I've stayed in 26 places. I had 53 appointments in. I started off with an Italian art therapist who had started a group like mine, but which had been going a year longer, and she was a trained art therapist. I stayed with the person who founded the British Art Therapy Association in London, and her husband had Parkinson's. I was put in touch with the, what's her name? The president of the British Art Therapy Association, again, whose husband had Parkinson's. So these were 3 people who'd got involved in their art therapy programs because their partners had Parkinson's. So they knew what I was dealing with, and they also had masses of advice and help, which they gave to me freely. I also travelled through America, went to the Struthers Centre for Parkinson's, which was a privately run organisation where they were running all sorts of alternative courses. But they weren't running an art course, so I found myself giving a talk about what I was doing over here, even though I was trying to learn about them over there. But through these I made all sorts of associations which continued over the next few years. And whilst I was travelling, I also saw things like an exercise programme outside in the car park with these people with Parkinson's sitting around in a circle, and the facilitator was throwing balls and they could catch them. I thought, that is amazing. And that's when I started to understand about automatic reflex in Parkinson's and the ways in which the brain works in different ways, that you could, for instance, well, let me give you an example. Like on aeroplanes, if you've got Parkinson's, you can't really sit near the exit because they say you'll be so slow getting off. Doctors will tell you they'll be the first people off the plane. When the alarm bell goes, they move. As soon as the left brain kicks in, and I can see Katrina is nodding over there, as long as they start to realise what is happening, then they freeze. But by then they'll be outside the aeroplane.
So how does that reflex then come into painting?
So with the painting thing, what I find interesting is quite often you get somebody coming to a class who knows what they're going to paint before they sit down. It very rarely works because they've been working themselves up to this idea instead of going along we present as a right-brained, it might be a poem, it might be music, it might be movement and exercise, but it's something to take them away from worrying about whether the medication's working, what they're having for lunch, all that left brain stuff, into a space which is very imaginative and creative. Now that works really well with Parkinson's because the left brain side has been damaged. So it's not working very well. The whole business of them walking, writing, speaking, the things that they're taught after they're born tend to, over time, phase off, tail off. The things that they are born with, that the response to music, the ability to draw, to create, the imaginative things are still there, and partly because the left brain is not working so well, the other bit seems to take off.
Right.
And I didn't know all that. I didn't know all that at the beginning, but over time, I met an amazing man, for instance, who had done a research project on people who were established artists when they contracted Parkinson's. One of them was Melvin, what's he called? Who wrote Gormenghast? What's his name? No, not that. No, Melvin Bragg. Bragg is the writer about English. What's his name? Mervyn Peake. In fact, Sebastian Peake, his son, opened our exhibition in London of painting with Parkinson's in 2003. He said that, if anything, his creativity improved after he got Parkinson's. Now, the person who'd done the research project was a Netherlandish neurologist, and he went into that project with the assumption that because the brain is damaged through Parkinson's, you would not be able to create as well as the Parkinson's developed as you did before. And some people have said that if there is an improvement, it's to do with the medication. But Mervyn Peake died before the medication came in. It came in 1969. So that was not responsible for his improvement. And many artists have said that. So once I got the hang of the idea of the creativity not being affected, I realised I was onto something. And when people sit, Janet will have seen it, when people sit down to paint, they just go off straight away. It's not, because it isn't about making great art, it's about painting, it's about making a mark on the paper, which leads to another mark, which leads to another mark, which leads to another mark. So if they're working just with the paper and that space, I'm saying it's automatic, it's not automatic, but one thing leads to another. You know that if someone with Parkinson's can't walk, if you can put a line on the floor there, help them get up or whatever, and say, right, step over that, they can do it. Now, if you've got a floor with no markings on it, and you say to the person with Parkinson's, come over here, they can't move. So you need prompts and triggers.
Yeah.
It took me a while to pick that one up, but I did get it in the end.
So the Churchill Fellowship brought you a lot to bring back.
When I came back, I completely revamped the programme.
Yeah.
It was no longer... I realised I didn't need to teach people how to, or help people how to make those marks. The main thing was how do they make that first mark?
To get that started.
Yeah, just how do we get them started?
So, Nancy, we're going to start to come into a sharing, reflective time in the moment that you have brought us all into with your lovely sharings. So, all these expressions through nets and net art and networking. So, is there something that's like in you that's like called you to express through nets and networking and art?
Well, there's two instances. One, me going for a walk and thinking, I know what I'll do, I'll start an art group and I'll call it Painting with Parkinson's. They were like flashes of inspiration.
Right.
And the second one was making nets and thinking, this is about networking, and I wonder where this will lead us.
Mm. Was there something also in all of that that's like, I mean, those things are personal as well, but something like within you that you needed to put out into the world in a way through nets?
Well, I think it was very important for me to find something which was not Parkinson's and which was not about caring for somebody all the time. Because I really wasn't terribly good at that, and I found it hard.
Mm.
And I needed some way of getting that balance. And obviously, obviously when you're bringing up a family and doing all sorts of other things, you can't be painting all the time. But I would have slots where I'd say, right, for the next 3 weeks, don't bother to come and, just keep away, please.
Yeah.
After that, fine. But you needed slots where you needed to do it. I needed to do that myself.
For yourself. So it was about your own supporting yourself.
It was.
Much as
Well, it was about staying sane in a very insane situation.
And look what's happened. You've brought all this beauty into the world for everyone, from many people. So, thank you, Nancy. Let's just take a couple of quiet moments to sit, and then I'd really like to invite you and encourage you to maybe turn to the person next to you and maybe share some of your responses of what's come up for you or what you might have thinking about nets or networking, whatever comes up for you, and then we'll come back to allow to sharing and some questions. So just take your time for the next few minutes. One of them is certainly observing everybody coming to life, and being so stimulated by what the storyteller has brought to us. So it's just so lovely to see everyone talking and the noise of the conversation, so that I have to stamp or something. It's just great. So let's open it up now to, if you'd like to share any of your responses that you've just shared in a small group, or if you have a question for Nancy.
I'd like Nancy to reflect on what would her life have been like if Bob hadn't got Parkinson's.
That's a big reflection.
It's a big one, and actually we can go even further back on that. I was very happily in a little cottage in the country, which I was buying in England. As a child, that's all I wanted. I wanted to buy a cottage in the country, and I was going to live there forever and ever, until I was about 19, because by then I was on the shelf. I was 29, This is 70 years ago, something, 60 years ago. And then Bob arrived, and then of course I ended up here, and everything changed, and I never went back to the cottage in the country. But yes, Bob's Parkinson's was the real spanner in the works. And it probably held me into taking control of my life. I couldn't just drift along anymore. I had to make big decisions. And we talked a bit with Valerie about the fact that until then, every decision I made was quite clear-cut. That was the right decision, and then it went on to the next decision, like, a job offer or something came at the right time, and you find the cottage comes at the right time. But once Bob was diagnosed with Parkinson's, every decision had its downsides. For instance, after a few years, and Bob had by then retired, he also had terrible trouble with his hips. He had 6 big operations, and he promised his mother that we should go back to England every year to see her when his father died. Well, that was all very well, but we were getting to the stage of thinking, okay, well, I take him over to see his mother and my parents, and then we come back, and then his mother becomes ill, or somebody dies and we have to go back. I honestly didn't think I could do that twice a year. I could do it once a year, because Bob was wheelchair, you know, travel and so on. And he travelled well. But I just felt that the drawn. So I thought, why don't we go live over there for a little while? So we did, and in many respects that was the right decision. But my youngest son, I don't think has forgiven me for deserting him. He was 21, but even so, he did comment that he felt that we had deserted him. And I think every time I had to make a sort of decision which perhaps suited Bob, it might not suit the others, or it seemed the right thing for the boys, it was not necessarily right for Bob.
Yeah, so life became always many sides to consider.
Yes, and I
Can
hadn't
I
been
invite-
aware of that before.
Yeah, can I invite someone else to share a response? To next, Art? Yes.
Thank you, Nancy. I was really struck by with the nets, like the string of spaces in between. And I guess I was really thinking about when you're talking about Parkinson's and Bob, like the tension, in the body and
Yes.
the places that don't work so well, and the kind of what's still there but what's also gone of the person.
That's coming. Chantal worked a lot with Bob in his last years in the care home, so she knew him very well. I don't think tension is spoken about enough in Parkinson's. Bob, as I mentioned earlier, had a lot of trouble with hips. He had both hips replaced, but one of them kept breaking, and we had to have those redone, and it went on for years and years and years. And I had both hips done as well. You hold the tension in the hips, and that's what we were doing. We were both under huge tension. I learned the Alexander technique, but not early on. That came later. And so, how we deal with tension was a whole area for people to, because they're battling to make sure that they can try and do things which they might not be able to do, and they want to be able to do things like they used to do. And that the body is holding that tension somewhere, and then you get injury. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you manage that tension yourself?
Well, I did the Alexander technique, which was hugely helpful, and that's very helpful for Parkinson's. They've done 2 big research projects on that, partly using Michael Stenning's tape, which is mostly his wife doing the direction, who is in Canberra. That was it. The research was done in London. We're not saying that it stopped the progression of the disease, but what it does, it deals with the symptoms, so that if you're learning how to, it's not exactly relax the body, but take tension out of the body, then that is also helping to take the tension out of the symptom in the Parkinson's. Oh, Katrina.
I was going to say, I actually go once a week to the Botanical Gardens to Jinjai, and there's a young girl there who comes from the same village where I was born, and she's done a lot of study in Parkinson's, and what we worked out, and therapists before her, is hot stones. She works with hot stones with me, and massages in with that. And she'll tell me where, at the end of each session, she'll tell me where all the tension spots are and where she had to work, and
Well, we haven't mentioned flow, although you in fact introduced me to that work.
to the flow concept, and then see she's loosening things up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've managed to get the NJS to pay for that. So that's
So if someone with Parkinson's is approaching the art activity, for instance, and they're very tense, they probably can't move. So, the whole program is set up so that we have to somehow find a way of releasing that tension, either well, with music and movement mainly.
Yeah.
There's that, and see, when she did what they play is Indigenous music, tapes and often sounds of Australian natural sounds while that's happening as well. There's a whole,
Yeah,
mind-body connection.
yeah.
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 Can I just ask a question? How do you see and feel living in the UK and then living here
Yeah.
has informed your art? How does that? Because I know my friend Keiko Schmeiser, who's
Coming from Japan.
originally from Japan, and she's lived and worked in Australia for a long time. And there's another dimension to her art, even though it's recognisably Japanese. She feels that the light and space has broadened her sort of view of how she sees the world and how she practices her art.
Well, I don't know how Keiko, maybe she embraced the light. I found it really difficult because I'd come from an area full of mists and greys, and it took me 3 years to come to terms with the landscape here before I could get back to, because I was really a landscape painter, to come to terms with the landscape.
It's interesting that you're doing works around Lake George.
Well, oh yes,
Because
yes,
there's
because
that
that's important.
Sort of effect.
I lived near in the northwest near an area called Morecambe Bay, which is some of you may remember the time when I think it was it 15, were they Chinese or Vietnamese, who died because they were left out in the currents in the middle of Morecambe Bay instead of being brought in after picking the cockles. Well, that's the area I lived very near, and it was very flat landscape, and I'd done a lot of work which was very horizontal about that part of the country. And very, very soon after I arrived here, we drove past Lake George, and I thought, this is what I want to paint. Of course, it took me years to get around to it, even though it was only half an hour from where I lived. And now I'm working on that again, because in Lake George, people drowned in the Morecambe Bay. This is a duality thing again. It's a very grand, moving, very impressive area, but it has a dark side, and both those did. And I felt that it was like, two ends of the bookends, where I lived over there and then where I've lived over here, and that's what I'm working on. I'm going actually onto a workshop out at Lake George next week, to do some more work on that.
It's a very, very special light out at Lake George, especially now at the moment with all the water.
And the
Yeah.
reflections and so on.
Would anyone like to share anything of their responses to the net art of Nancy's a piece, or it's drawing them to keep looking at it?
Shall I go over?
No,
Hold on.
it's-
Perhaps I could talk a little bit about them, because the piece, which is of two kinds of wool, at the back there, is about combining the two lives, which is what Peter was talking about. So, after doing a lot of art therapy work, although never qualifying as an art therapist, but learning a lot about it, I realised that what I wanted to do was to sort this problem of living in two countries or living in two cultures through my artwork. And when Bob went into care, I had the opportunity to do that. And I was living up in the northwest of England. And I decided to attach myself to the art school in Carlisle, which is 25 miles away, and go and perhaps go to a printmaking course or something. I'd done quite a lot of studies about the difference in the two sorts of landscape, but I needed a little bit more guidance, perhaps control over it. So I went to the art school and they said, well, the courses that you want to go to are full. And anyway, you can't do them because they're access courses and they're for people who haven't been associated with art and you've spent your whole life doing it. So you can't do that. So they said, bring your portfolio in and we'll have a look at it. So I did that. And they said, well, we think you should be doing an MA and it starts tomorrow. And what they said was, you can either do applied art, which would be run by the textile department, or you could do fine art. So I went to talk to each people. And as I found when I was a student many years before in Newcastle, the fine art people were really difficult to talk to. I mean, they were... Anyway, I won't go into that in detail. But the applied art people were fantastic, and I needed a bit of mothering, you know, I needed somebody to look after me in a way, and they were wonderful. And they got me into looking at materials, different sorts of materials, and in the end I came down to thinking I want to symbolise the life in England with Herdwick wool, which is from the local sheep, which were, as they say, hefted to the Lake District. They never wandered anywhere else. In fact, during foot and mouth, the farmers let them go to get out of the way of the people coming up from London killing off all the sheep. They used to let the sheep disappear on the hillsides because they knew the sheep would not get lost. They wouldn't move away from the Lake Districts. They'd just be lost to the ministry or whatever. Anyway, and the other thing was to have a white merino fibre. Oh, Herdwick, by the way, is a dark fibre, whereas merino is the white, and so I combined those in various ways. I either felted them together or spun them together. So that's an example of spinning the two fibres together, so the two sides of my life. And what interested me was that merino wool comes from a sheep which behaves extremely badly, but it's the most beautiful wool. Herdwick comes from a sheep which is so sweet and gorgeous, and it's the toughest, hardest wool. You can only really use it for carpets. So, and I thought, well, is that about behaviours in different countries? When I'm over here, do I behave differently from how I behave in England? So there are a whole lot of metaphors to do with, so that's what that one's about, I suppose.
So
yeah.
that's beautiful to hear that background story.
So they do have a story.
That's really beautiful. So I'm just looking at the time. One more question, yes, or response.
Nancy, I remember first when you at the Art Centre and you had an extraordinary exhibition, that beautiful work you did with all the little seeds that you had pinned. It just was the most stunning work I think I've ever seen. Perhaps could I help you to just describe it a bit to everybody here, and how did that fit into your networking concept?
Well, it was a net of a kind anyway, and it was a net made of seed heads which were put together without any glue or stitch, which just clung to one another. But the trick was that you couldn't separate them without them disintegrating, so you had to know exactly where each piece was. So technically it was quite difficult to do. But that had a silly story associated with it as well. I came from the part of England where Andy Goldsworthy came from. So those of you who know his work, he works in the landscape with whatever he happens to find. It might be a clump of dandelions, it might be some sticks or stones or whatever, and he uses those to create environmental art, often works with ice and so on. And I loved his work. And I was on a masterclass up at Tumbarumba with Ruth Hadlow, and I was going on about Andy Goldsworthy, and she's got sick of it, and she said, "Go off and do an Andy Goldsworthy." So I went off into the forest and started playing around with bits of bark and twigs, and nothing was happening. I thought, oh, this is a total waste of time. So I started to walk back to the base, and I had these little things sticking over my socks. And that started a whole body of work. I did about a dozen pieces about these. They're called bidgie widgies, and they're about 2 or 3 meters across. And when you put two together, they cling, but you can't pull them apart without them disintegrating. So I worked out ways of making them in blocks. So I went up to Tumbarumba and took plastic containers. They're those folder things which are about 2 centimetres gap inside, so they're just about big enough to take. So I make them in blocks, and then eventually, I think in that exhibition at Belconnen Art Centre, I actually set the piece up in the gallery, because otherwise it was too fragile to carry.
So that's a wonderful piece of art to finish on. And how we need to be just noticing the smallest thing where it can take us to lovely big things like what you've shared tonight with NETS, Net Art and Network In. Thank you, Nancy. Don't forget, if you want to be on the Canberra mailing list, there's a paper up there so you can see who's going to bring us a heart story in November.